WebTag has been around for a very long time, and it determines which transport investments are made. However, the criteria it uses, although they're very broad when you read the whole stream, in practice they don't take into account a large number of things. Their primary motivation is reducing of time for driving cars, which is reasonable because when driving cars it's limited in what one can do. But, for example, with rail, actually you can become far more productive if you spend time on a train. They also do not in any way take in, or the WebTag analysis does not in any way take account of the potential for housing and investment and developing of new townships and locations. So I wonder if you could give us an insight as to whether it's being reviewed. I'm sure it is, I read about it a bit, but how it's being reviewed and when, please.
Stefan, that seems to be right in your...
Sounds like me.
And also, thank you very much, everybody, for 3 fascinating presentations.
Well, thank you. And so we hear a lot about WebTag and tag in general, and we're very alive to the concerns that people have about it. I think it's fair to say that if I had my way, then things would be very, very different. But of course, there are lots of other considerations from other parts of the department, and sadly, the housing and transport team doesn't run the place. But we are in very close work with the analytical team at DFT, and you may have read that the Treasury will soon be reviewing the Green Book, which is the sort of overarching mechanism that analytical frameworks across government sit in. So DFT will be playing into that. I think it's fair to say that TAG is a reflection of the Green Book rather than the other way around. We have to sort of comply with what the Treasury wants us to do. So, our priorities have tended towards congestion relief in the past. But I think actually it's also fair to say that it is pretty broad, WebTag. And if you take the Housing Infrastructure Fund, for example, we've said yes to pretty much every sustainable scheme that came forward, and we were able to work with councils to sort of make sure that it complied with TAG if it needed to, if it was going to fall foul otherwise. We're very keen to do more of that work and keen to, if TAG is the problem, to help people get around it rather than, I think actual reform of the appraisal itself is going to take much more time than we would be keen to see these schemes coming forward. So there is movement. It's probably going to be quite slow, but the message is very much we want to see more sustainable transport come forward, and if councils or developers feel like TAG is getting in the way, then please ask us and we can help with dealing with that.
We haven't yet talked about decarbonisation, and it strikes me that that's an area where we know transport is the sector in terms of decarbonising which has got the greatest challenge still. And if you look at our performance, I think the department is doing some serious thinking around decarbonisation, which presumably comes into that kind of conversation. I don't know whether you're able to...
It's one of the 2 big challenges we've been set by number 10. And so the department has just published the first iteration of a 2-stage process for a massive decarbonisation of transport plan. The first stage was pretty much setting out what we thought the challenge was and where we think there are great areas of potential. Particularly in this area, modal shift is going to be a massive part of that. And I was particularly interested, Martin, about what you mentioned earlier about, could you develop a housing settlement that had no roads, that it was a purely rail-based or other-based development? I think, I suspect no is the answer if you were trying to go through the current system, but I would be very keen to see such a thing. And I also am absolutely certain that our ministers are very keen to see those kind of innovative ideas come forward. So it's very much a message of, if you've got a crazy idea, bring it, and we'll make the system work for you rather than the other way around. But also there's a lot of stuff about future of mobility and sort of different vehicles being used, and particularly when you think about the beaching lines, £500 million probably not going to go that far in unlocking the lines that have been shut down, but that's only if you're thinking about it in terms of a heavy rail. And actually there are loads of new interesting systems that run on the railway lines but aren't heavy rail, and so much cheaper to deploy. We're very, very interested to think about that and to think about what the future of mobility can offer in terms of decarbonisation.
And I just wondered, John, whether you might want to build on it, because I'm just building on this thing about the role of facilitating and doing things differently. And I know you mentioned in your presentation about the support for the garden town, the garden village type of approach, which and also your role as a master planner. I just wonder whether that's something that could help in this agenda, making the just case for it.
Well, I guess the question for me hinges around how do you appraise investment? How do you appraise options? And certainly traditionally, you know, engineers like numbers, and I like way of capturing the value of things numerically. But the challenge, I think, is to, you know, ask the question: how do you actually broaden out the appraisal process to capture things that are broader than capture urban design or place-based factors that maybe aren't as easily monetised? And how do you embrace that into an overall appraisal process? Now, there's quite an interesting document a couple of years ago now called the Place Standard Tool that was produced by the Scottish Government, that I thought was quite interesting because it presents quite an holistic array of factors in considering what makes a place work. And the question, I suppose, for transport is to what extent that sort of approach can be transposed onto transport investment appraisal. And similarly, when it comes to looking at places and garden towns, that more holistic urban design and place-based optioneering process, arguably, is somewhere that is the direction that we should be thinking about. Equally, as it applies to the transport aspects of new housing development.
I was listening to Radio 4 yesterday morning while I was cycling into work, and it had an interesting article about the past 10 years being the lost generation, and whereby life expectancy has stalled and in unfortunate some circumstances decreased. Do we accept that over the past 10 years the housing market has stalled, and how can we essentially gear up to providing 300,000 houses by the middle of this coming decade, given the fact that a recent survey of house builders confirmed that whilst 57% were confident that they could increase their housing completions, they were significantly, negative about actually meeting those completion targets of 300,000. And the reasons they cited for that, it's unfortunate reasons, is land availability. When a client comes to me, the first two questions I will ask are, can I get access? Will it flood? Secondly, the planning system and the failure of the planning system in some regards. And thirdly, the upfront funding of infrastructure. So it's a bit of a three-headed beast in that regard. And as transport planning professionals, we have a contribution to make, but unfortunately there are other dynamics in play that could stymie that delivery target.
I think you've got to sort of one has to appreciate that housing delivery is a complex issue. It's a sort of like a wicked problem. I don't think there is one easy answer to it. I suppose I would refer you to the Homes England strategic plan, which sets out the key tenets of how we're proposing to try and facilitate the housing market getting up to that level. In terms of land release, then, I think there's an issue of how do you facilitate the land coming forward when essentially it's in private ownership. At the end of the day, you can't force people to sell their land if they don't want to, obviously without going through the CPO route, which is very cumbersome and difficult to progress. So we are, to some extent, we are at the mercy of the market in delivering land supply. But Homes England is trying to promote a much bigger pipeline of land supply that we can then take forward ourselves in conjunction with the private sector to make housing happen. And in that context, we're not trying to steal the low-hanging fruit from housing developers. We're out there to try and deliver sites that perhaps are a little bit more tricky, as appropriate with the use of government funding programmes. So not an easy problem to solve, and a multifaceted problem and challenge, I think.
I think the challenge that I'd reflect upon from the question would be the absence of strategic planning at a significant level. That's a real challenge for us if we're having to engage with 350 local authorities, all who see strategic as their backyard. And how do we, this is where I think the subnational transport bodies are really, really helpful for us, in terms of how do we have those strategic level conversations that assess need, but get the developments in the right place with the right mix. Because otherwise what we end up doing with local plan responses or local development responses is responding in a reactive way, and it's much harder for us to be proactive because we just haven't got the resources to go and do that in the way you would want us to be able to do that. There are challenges, I think, when you plan at that strategic level, because actually what you probably end up doing, and I think we're seeing this through the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, is you consolidate development in certain places, which generates even potentially greater impact. But I think that's where my reflection is something we would be much keener to be in a space of, is where we're proactively seeking to plan alongside other partners, alongside the rail industry, alongside combined authorities, alongside other transport providers, where we can understand what the impact on our network is as part of bringing forward a development through, rather than can these 300 homes be squeezed onto our network in a safe way.
I think I just kind of want to echo what Simon said, because we're very conscious of a lack of strategic planning in certain areas, and actually conscious that we've probably been the authors of that in some respect because of reductions in local government funding. We're very alive to that problem. I don't think there's we're not going to find a massive pot of money behind the sofa, but we are making the arguments for that and making the arguments for enabling that strategic planning to happen. I certainly hope that if we succeed, then we should start to see a bit of an improvement in this area.
I was a project director for a housing infrastructure fund application in the first round, and a relatively late addition to the HIF guidance was a condition that 70% of the funding would go to local authorities where average house price to salary ratio was above the average, essentially. A lot of my colleagues in the north shrugged their shoulders and said, here we go again. A relatively simple mapping exercise showed that the southeastern London therefore dominated the area that would be the recipient of 70% of the funding. How does that work with the aim of levelling up?
Stefan, are you moving to the north just like the Treasury?
Absolutely fair point to make. HIF was changed because of the fact that the previous ministers decided they wanted the focus to be on the areas that, in a sort of similar to predict and provide scenario where there was most need for housing around London and the commuting areas. So that's where they wanted the housing to go. Obviously, we now have a new administration. HIF has predominantly happened now, so it's sort of in the past. The new administration is absolutely dedicated to that not being the case anymore, and for particularly infrastructure funding to be flowing to the north and to the Midlands. So I would be hugely surprised if that were a similar condition, at least to the same extent. Obviously, there is still great demand in the southeast, and we're not going to be blind to that. But the infrastructure funding, and actually outside of HIF as well, because let's not forget that there's going to be enormous investment, is particularly in rail in the north in the next 20 years. So, HIF, I suspect, will not be in that sort of 80-20 ratio that it was in its next iteration. I can't say any more than that at the moment, but I would be really surprised if it was.
I was just struck with the prisoners of the past from, I think it was you, John, that talked about that. And then the optimism from Stefan, which, thank you for that, Stefan. This lack of strategic planning, does that, in my relatively simple brain, say if we've actually got a strategy of what we want transport to do, then that's the starting point, because actually everything flows from that. So we've got, transport's going to change. We've got decarbonisation, we've got autonomous vehicles, we've got an automotive industrial sector that needs support, and that's linked into both of those arguments. We've got Highways England, Homes England, who want to do better things. That's what I heard from each of the speakers. So why don't we just set out what it is that we want to achieve and tell transport what it needs to do? Because at the moment, we've got mixed messages, I think. And that's not saying we don't want to change, because I think we probably do want to change. So if we had a strategy just said, this is what we want transport to do, that might help.
10 years on from when we lost the regional spatial strategies, it seems to be that there is this desire for something that we need at a strategic level. Simon, do you want to just reflect?
Yeah, I think two thoughts back on that. I think one, there's a fairly easy one, which is early on, which is about visibility. If we could see where all the local plan strategic sites were in one place, then that would be a real help in terms of strategic plans. We could put key data that we own and that is in the public domain, we could make that available. There's some platforming in terms of using technology that we could be a lot more, not even innovative with, just be smarter with in terms of how we actually share information at that level. There'll be a bedrock of conversations there. We'd be much more efficient. We could concentrate on what it is we assure and own ourselves, and that would naturally give us a platform to kind of join up. I think the second part of that, and this is where I'll kind of throw the microphone to Stefan, is we've got to do what we're told, because ultimately our client pays and they give us a clear brief in terms of what it is to do. So picking up on one of the previous questions around carbon and housing growth, is how do we respond and reflect on those governmental priorities if we need to take that steer from government in terms of should we be using carbon as part of that response, or should we be supporting the ambition to deliver lots of housing? Because you can't necessarily in all these situations have both. But again, in that space, and I guess hopefully maybe when the RIS is announced in a couple of weeks' time, we'll get that clarity and direction. But as I say, we need to do as we're told.
As Andrew will know, we've taken the point about a sort of mixed messaging coming from central government in this space. And we do intend to do something about that, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 months. And I think the second point is, as a point that Simon just made, there are different push and pulls within the department. Lots of teams sitting there talking about, how are we driving economic growth? And, if you're thinking about the strategic network, how we're getting HGVs from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And so immediately you're talking about congestion relief, and you're talking about expanding lanes and more building and building and building. And, that's not the same push as decarbonisation, sustainability. And I think our team very much sits on that second half. But we are not the only people in the department, that we're not the only considerations in place. That being said, I think the government and the Prime Minister has been very clear that decarbonisation has to filter through into every part of the department and of government. So, it's a challenge for all of those teams about how they do that and how you grow sustainably. It is harder. And I think, even if you talk to MSCLG, they have very ambitious housing targets. We walk into the meeting, we say, we'd love you to do this by building a railway instead of a road. And they say, great, but actually that's going to slow everything down. We're not going to meet those targets. So, there are lots of pushes and pulls, and we're, as I said in my speech, making those arguments as loudly as we can. I don't think there's a magic bullet. I don't think we're necessarily going to win every time, but I think there are lots of things to take into consideration.
Homes England are mere vessels for the implementation of government policy. Having said that, I think from Homes England point of view, what do we want transport to do? I think we want transport to open up sites for development. We want transport to make an enhanced site viability. We want transport to make sites attractive to end users, so that those sites and the homes on them are attractive and people want to buy them so that they can come forward. So we will, I suppose, start from the bottom up at the site level from a transport point of view, and rely on our colleagues in DFT and then Highways England to maybe think more strategically.